Okay, so welcome to this evening where we're hosting Bריג'יט, Diane. Today from Chicago, but I understand sometimes in Manhattan, sometimes
usually in Manhattan,
in lots of places. I was very excited about the opportunity to chat with you this evening here from מרכז חדרים in Haifa. I had a chance to peek at your bio and was interested in everything. I basically want to hear about everything you're doing and how this journey of yours is coming together. So, would you mind starting in right now? You're in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Right now, I'm in Chicago visiting my mother, whom we haven't seen since right before Kehonah. Obviously, it was hard to come, and we drove here from New York, which was a long drive, but we made it into a road trip. My husband and myself, our two children, and I brought my niece with me also, and we surprised my mother. She didn't know that her other granddaughter was coming. So I feel very fortunate to be able to see my mom during these times. We didn't want to fly. And we're starting to feel just a little bit that with all this Corona madness, that we can finally do some of the things that we were not able to do in March, April, May, June. So very, very fortunate to be here. But as you said, even though I grew up in Chicago from the age of 8 on, I live in Manhattan on the Upper West Side.
Okay. So can I ask you, what is Manhattan like now after March? I was supposed to be there in March for Purim. My trip got canceled.
Of course.
This is after I've lived in New York the last 3 years before coming back to Israel. Another
you did?
story.
Wow. Yeah, I would love to hear that.
And we'll switch roles.
We'll switch, yeah.
But what's Manhattan like now? Subways, all the beautiful concert places, Times Square, parks.
Well, I think we have to first go back and say, what was Manhattan like in March and April? Because I've been living in Manhattan for 18 years, and I never saw anything like what we saw in March when Kehonah started. It was really scary. I was just telling my sister here that we didn't realize, you don't realize when you're in a crisis sometimes, when you're in the midst of a crisis, but when you hear out of your living room window an ambulance every 30 seconds, day or night, doesn't matter what time, you're constantly hearing ambulances. And you know those ambulances are because of COVID. When you're seeing that 800 people a day are dying in your city, when you hear about people in your community being sick, someone's father passing away from COVID, it really hit close to home. It also hit close to home because I don't know if you know this, but when COVID started in New York, it went straight for the Jewish community, particularly the modern Orthodox community. There was a bar mitzvah in New Rochelle. SAR, which is a Jewish school in Riverdale, was the first one to close. All the Jewish schools closed a few days later. And really everyone we knew at the beginning were people in our community. And this is before we really knew the full impact of community transmission. And so we were all still trying to figure out. I remember my nephew was the chavruta of the boy at YU whose father was called Ground Zero.
I remember,
yes.
Yeah.
Do you remember that, right? And
right
so
in the beginning.
Right at the beginning. And my nephew is his chavruta, so he studies with him face to face. And we had seen my nephew for a family weekend right before. And this is when we didn't know anything about Kehonah. And we were trying to figure out who saw him. Was it 6 feet? Was it more than 10 minutes? But he was asymptomatic. So therefore, you can't transmit it. Am I going into quarantine? We had this crazy scenario where the night of Purim, my husband went to shul with my kids, and I stayed home because I had a little cough. I don't know if I had a cough. I think it might have been psychological, but I just didn't know. And I didn't think I should go. And so it was a crazy time. And I think for the Jewish community in New York, we felt that we quarantined a good 2 weeks before, 3 weeks even before everyone else. And then finally the mayor and the governor got on board, and we were just kind of waiting for them to close the schools and close the restaurants and all the indoor venues. Once that happened, New York was a ghost town. and it was really frightening. And it was frightening because we hear the ambulances, and because we didn't know what was happening, and because we thought we could get corona from a letter in the mail or a package, and because you're together with your husband and children 24 hours a day, which can be lovely, but it can also be difficult. It's not the normal state of things. And the children trying to navigate Zoom, trying to navigate your own life, and really, I think one of the most difficult things of Corona for parents is that we were put in a situation where we had to be everything all of a sudden, right? We're used to, in our lives, to delegating. So obviously I educate my children, but the bulk of their education is in school. And of course I take care of my house, but I also have a housekeeper who helps me. And I try to talk to my children and be their friend, but they also have social friends and peers that they speak to. And all of a sudden, you're in a situation where you're the plumber, you're the cafeteria lady, you're the friend that they can't see. You're everything. You're the teacher because you're helping on Zoom. And so that was really tough. And New York was really, really deserted, and it was really the epicenter of what was happening. And I remember that for 6 weeks, my only outing was maybe a walk around the block, if that, or just going to the lobby of my building to get my mail. Little by little, New York started coming back, and New York was really smart, I think, in how they did everything. And I praise Governor Cuomo for this, not really the mayor, but he was really smart and methodical and data-driven. And I think that that's why our numbers now are so low. Our numbers in New York are very low. And private schools are planning to reopen. Public schools, as of now, are planning to reopen up to 3 days a week. So New York is starting to come back, which is a good thing. People are out. People are going out. There's no indoor restaurants, but people are eating outdoors. But having said that, and we can talk about this maybe later, what we're seeing now in New York is the economic effects, the economic impact of COVID. And that is a whole set of issues and challenges that will need to be addressed.
Right. What kind of steps you think he did that were particularly helpful, maybe for others to learn from, Como?
Yeah. I think, first of all, he was accessible to the people. He held a news conference every day at 11 a.m. Everyone knew to tune into it. And he was very calm in his news conference. He wasn't alarmist, but he wasn't dismissive. He told you the facts. He told you what to do. He instilled a sense of confidence in the people. And he also made sure that we had to meet metrics as a state before we could enter phase one. So every part of New York, except New York City, entered phase one before we did. It felt like it took forever for New York to enter phase one because you had to meet certain metrics of hospitalizations, ICU beds. And we finally qualified to enter phase one. I think it was the second week in June, something like pretty late. And we had to stay in that phase for a while. And then, even when we entered phase 4, which is the last phase, he still hasn't allowed indoor dining, which is very, very smart because the states that did allow bars and indoor dining, like Florida and Arizona and Texas, have really suffered. And also one other thing I will say is I'm really proud of New Yorkers in the sense that they wear masks. They're really careful with social distancing. Of course, there's exceptions, but by and large, when I walk around New York, everyone's wearing a mask outdoors. And here I've been in Chicago. We drove to get here. So we stopped in Cleveland and other places. And people don't seem to be wearing masks or having the same caution, quite the same amount of caution.
Yeah, maybe they were not hit so hard in the beginning. So it's harder for them to imagine how awful it can get. How about subways, transportation, always so crowded and so everybody, so hard to create these 6 feet, 2 meters separation.
Yeah, so I will tell you, I've not taken the subway since probably the first week in March, and I don't plan on taking it anytime soon. I'm a walker. I love walking. It's the summer, so I didn't have so many appointments or reasons to take the subway. And I hear the subway is very clean. I hear that it's not crowded at all, and people are wearing masks. So if I needed to take it, I would. But for now, if I can avoid it, then I think that I've just been very cautious throughout. I wear my mask everywhere. We only see people outdoors socially. And even then we see them outdoors and it's very limited. We're not seeing anybody in our houses. I don't have anyone, I don't have workers. I don't have a cleaning lady. I don't have anyone coming into my house.
Yeah.
We don't have friends coming into our house. So my family personally is being very careful, but I understand that the subway is up and running, the buses, and it seems, look, New York's rates we've been in phase 4 for, I want to say 5 weeks, and our numbers have not gone up. So that's a good sign.
Excellent. Encouraging, I mean, there was like reports as if this is it for New York. And I'm glad to hear from you that life has the power to reconstruct itself with the assistance of the state's leaders. So that's good.
It does. And at the same time, though, I'm sorry to interrupt you. At the same time, I do want to say that what we're starting to see in New York for the last month or so is the real economic impact of COVID. And so while our numbers are low and health-wise we're doing well, thank God, there's a lot more people who are homeless. There's a lot more overdoses and drug addictions that we see on the street. And the mayor of New York has come under a lot of fire because there's a plan where they put homeless people, including sex offenders, including people experiencing drug addiction, in hotel rooms in largely residential areas. And some people say, that's great, that's compassionate. And some people say, yes, that's compassionate, but these people are not getting services. And so they're free. They have a hotel room, they're free all day. And so my neighborhood, the Upper West Side, and several other neighborhoods in New York are experiencing now an uptick in crime. We are seeing drugs on the street, drug buys, drug deals on the street. We're seeing needles on the street, people, drunken behavior, men who are harassing women. My girlfriends do not feel comfortable walking, certainly at night, and sometimes during the day. There are certain blocks we avoid. And it's showing us that there wasn't a safety net in New York for a lot of these people. And that the city is kind of just saying, okay, let's put them in a hotel room and forget about it. And now there's a lot of efforts to say, let's get services to these people. Let's see what we can do. A lot of people have left New York City, and the governor is aware of that. The mayor has said, well, if they want to leave, we'll replace them with someone else. But the governor, I think, understands that his tax base is possibly leaving the city. So it's competing values that we need to balance. And we haven't figured out the balancing act yet.
And we should mention that generally the Upper West Side was considered safe, and people walking after shows or events or going to meetings and so on. So it's not like the scary New York that maybe someone would expect, and it's an unfortunate turn in what happens in the city.
Right.
From what I read, Chicago and New York are not the only places you've lived in. So can you tell us
correct.
a little bit about your global journey? And maybe from there we'll hear about your specific interests in New York, primarily the Sephardic synagogue and things that are associated with that. I'd love to hear about that.
Sure. So I guess we'll start at the beginning with my parents. My parents are both from Morocco, French Morocco. And they left when they were adults. Funny enough, my parents did not meet in Morocco. They met in Chicago, of all places. 2 Moroccans in the 1960s in Chicago. They had to get married. No, it was actually a date, so it was a setup. And my older sister and I were born in Chicago, and we moved to France when I was a few months old. My father came to America from Marrakesh, where he's from. I tell the story because it's an interesting one, primarily for you as Israelis. B'nai Akiva had a program for Moroccan youth, all youth really, where they would bring them to spend a year in Thaxted, England, and it was a year of Hachshara to prepare them to make Aliyah, in this case to Kibbutz Levi. So my father was 17, and he went to spend a year in England, learned English, obviously, and he also learned what a kibbutz was. And he went back to Morocco. He was not a kibbutz type. So he went back to Morocco, but now he's 18 and he speaks fluent English. So MGM Studios put an ad in the newspaper that they needed somebody, they were filming a movie called Sadia in Marrakesh, and they needed somebody who could translate between English, French, and Arabic. Yeah. And my father could. So he saw the ad, and you know, as the people in that generation were, they were really street smart. He knew right away this was his ticket out of Morocco. Morocco had recently gotten independence from the French, and the Jewish community knew that they were either going to go to France or Israel, and my father knew he didn't want to go to a kibbutz, which is ironic because my father became a big Zionist. But so he made himself useful. He worked on the set of MGM Studios. The producer of the movie was Jewish, Henry Henningsen, took a liking to my father, and he sponsored my father to come to California in 1954. My father came to California, served in the Navy, got his citizenship that way. It was during the Korean War, but he didn't go abroad. He stayed stateside. And then really arbitrarily made his way to Chicago. And once in Chicago, he had already brought his family from Morocco to Paris, and then he brought them from Paris to Chicago. My mother's family, and she's from the capital of Morocco, Rabat, her family decided to go to Canada, to Montreal, which a lot of Moroccan Jews did. And so she had an aunt who had coincidentally settled in Chicago. And her aunt said, you know, I know a Moroccan boy here. Why don't you come to Chicago on your way to Montreal? I'll introduce you. So that's what happened. And they got married in 1968. And my older sister and I were born in Chicago. My father had worked all kinds of odd jobs, as men of that generation did, really finding your luck wherever you find it, wherever Mazal takes you. And Mazal took my father to meet Ray Kroc. And I don't know if you know who Ray Kroc is. Ray Kroc is the founder of McDonald's, the restaurants. Yeah. So my father met him in Chicago and opened a few McDonald's restaurants in Chicago. And the year now is 1971. I'm a baby. My older sister is also a baby. And my father has the bright idea that, wow, I speak French. Why don't I bring McDonald's to France? There was not only were there no McDonald's in France, but at that time, the French went home for lunch and ate a 3-course meal. There was no the idea of eating a hamburger with your hands, it's not what they did. So my father said, okay, I'll try it. And so we went to France. He got the McDonald's franchise for France. We went to France in 1972, and he opened the first McDonald's. Did not do well at all. The French wanted a fork and a knife, but little by little, it started doing better. And story for another time, but a very, very long story cut short is that at a certain point, McDonald's had a dispute with my father, wanted to buy him out, said he wasn't upholding McDonald's standards. My father thinks that they just felt they gave him too good of a deal with the royalties. Long story short, there was a lawsuit to keep the name. My father lost the lawsuit, changed the name of his restaurants to another name, and then sold them to another rival fast food company. So at that point, we moved back to America because my father's family was here. Yeah, so those are my travels. And now I should say at this point that my parents are really lovers of Israel, Chovevei Tzion. And so every vacation, if we were not in, my father was working and flying back and forth to Paris, but whenever we were not in Paris or Chicago, we were in Israel. So summers in Israel, Pesach in Israel, and we had a lot of families. You can imagine the Moroccans. We have family from Rosh Pinah down to Eilat, and everywhere in between.
Yeah. How about going back to Morocco and visit roots of the family there, or grandparents, great-grandparents?
Yeah, we've been. So my father never went back. My father was terrified to go back. He went back one time before he got married in the 1960s for his aunt's wedding. He says he was stopped at customs and he was nervous to go back. I went by myself. I was a journalist before. In my first career was a journalist, and for the Jewish newspaper in Chicago. And I had a contact at the Moroccan Tourism Bureau, and he said to me, "There's a music festival in Morocco. Do you want to go?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Okay, but you have to leave tomorrow." And it's funny when we think about it. This is before cell phones. I'm dating myself, and I said to my parents, I was 24 years old, single, a woman, and I said to my parents, "I'm going to Morocco tomorrow, and I don't have a cell phone, so there's really no way for you to reach me." And it just didn't occur to me that and my parents, to their credit, said, okay, just be careful. So I went to Morocco twice in my 20s, and it was really a bikur shorashim for me. I really did a lot of research. On one of my trips, I went to the archives. It's not even archives. I went to the synagogue in Marrakesh, and I spoke to the last remaining rabbi, and I said, my great-grandfather was a famous rabbi, a mekubal, and he was also a sofer. So he took me and opened these folio books, huge books, where the community's records were kept, ketubot, kitin, death certificates. And he said, oh, around what year was your great-grandfather here? So we found some documents that my great-grandfather wrote and signed with his name.
Wow.
And I said, I got to take these. And he said, no, you can't. They belong to the community.
Right.
I said, well, I got to make a copy. He said, okay, you can go to the gas station down the street. I said, I don't think I'm going to take this to the gas station down the street. So he went for me, and I didn't tell my father. And I came back and I showed him his grandfather's signature on these documents, which was really, my grandfather was no longer alive, sadly, but I showed my father. And so, yeah, I did go back to Morocco. And then more recently with my mother, my father is no longer alive, sadly, but with my mother, Pesach a year and a half ago, we went to Morocco with my sisters and their families and my mother. And she had not been back since 1968. And we went to her hometown of Rabat. And we went to the Melach. The Melach was the Jewish area where Jews lived in Arab countries. And she really wasn't emotional before we went. And she said, no. And then as we get closer, the bus is getting closer, and she starts to recognize things. It was unreal. We go inside the Melach, and she just takes a minute to get her bearings. She had not been there in 68, so this is 50 some years, right? Mm-hmm. And she leads us.
Could recognize where she was.
She knew where she was. Things. She said, "This was my brother's school. This was our school. This was the shop where we did this." And then we found her house, and we knocked on the door, and there was a family. Her house was divided into 4 little apartments. So there were 4 families there. They were very kind. We told them, why we were there. We took the whole thing on video, and she showed us, this was my grandmother's room. This is where I would do my homework. And it was really, it was really something. So I'm very happy now when I hear about the peace treaty with United Arab Emirates, and I'm hearing rumors that Morocco is next. And I know that Israel and Morocco have some relations. That makes me very happy because these are 2 places close to my heart.
Yeah, close to many. So yes. It would make tourism a great treasure assets. I think, people already trying to go or going, so that'd be interesting. And I guess from what I read, this took you in 2 directions that might be interesting to our listeners and audience. One is the Sephardi synagogue in New York, in the Sephardi community in New York. So would love to hear about that. And the other thing you mentioned kind of in passing it, your parents met in the setup. And I understand you are or were involved in matchmaking. So yes. I'm sure we'd love to hear about how that
sure.
world works.
Sure. Okay. So first I should tell you that no one is more surprised than I am that I'm involved in the Sephardic community in New York. And the reason for that is that even though I come from a very strong French-Moroccan home and our minhagim are very strong, I was raised in Chicago primarily, where there are not a lot of Sephardim. And my parents belonged to an Ashkenazi synagogue. And my older sister married an Ashkenazi, as Ashkenazi as they come. And I went to New York. And I really wasn't so involved in the Sephardic community. I was single in New York, but there is a French community in New York, which is largely Sephardic. And I met 1 or 2 people in that community, and they introduced me to their friends. And what happened is I then had different crowds in New York. I had my American friends and I had my French friends. And these were all French expats who left France after 2002. If you remember the Second Intifada, the anti-Semitism in France, a lot of Jews started leaving. Many went to Israel, but a lot of the young Jews who were working in finance came to New York. They got visas from their banks and came to New York.
Just to clarify, this is when you say American friends and French friends, the Jewish American and Jewish French, or?
Primarily, because I worked in the Jewish community my whole life. So my social crowd is primarily, but not exclusively Jewish.
Yeah.
My French crowd is Jewish. And so through them, I got to know the Sephardic community of New York. And I should say there's the Syrian community, which is very established. My sister married a Syrian, so I have a lot of connections to that community, and I appreciate it very much. But that is its own community. And they have their own synagogues. They're primarily in Brooklyn and Deal, a little bit on the Upper East Side of New York. My husband and I are part of the Maghrebi community, North African, Tunisian, Algerian, Moroccan. And so I started getting a little bit involved in the synagogue there. When I got married, my husband, who is also French-Moroccan, that's also another story, we knew each other as kids in Paris. And then we were set up on a blind date. And he said, I think I know you. So when we got married, he moved from Philadelphia, where he was living, to New York. And I brought him to my synagogue. And at that time, I was very involved. I was on the board. I chaired the rabbinic search committee. And then little by little, I stepped back from the synagogue and got more involved in other parts of the community. And my husband got more involved in the synagogue. So he's now the president of this North African synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. We were on 84th Street. We just moved last Shabbat to a new beautiful location on 76th Street inside another synagogue. And the synagogue has really, really grown. And it started off being probably 80-90% French expats with a few Israelis. And now I would say we have Israelis, French, Syrian, Americans, a lot of families, a lot of singles. We do a lot of programming, and there's really a vibrant North African community on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is really amazing for me because I grew up this way in the home, but I never had it, and with my cousins, but I never had it in my social circles in Chicago. My children are growing up with the UN. They are growing up with American friends and South American friends and French friends. And so it's not unusual for them. They're not, the people, it's a very international crowd in our school, in our synagogue, in New York in general. And so I'm so thankful that my children have that diversity represented in their social and their daily life.
Mm-hmm. How does the shul decide on nusach and all these things that can get people on barricades?
Exactly. Well, since the shul was started as a North African shul, that's easy. We do North African nusach, primarily Moroccan nusach, only because the chazan is Moroccan. So that's easy. We have Tunisians who do Kriyat Torah, and they'll do it with Tunisian trope, which is very different than Moroccan trope. Tunisian is more similar to Syrian. But it's primarily North African, which by and large, the customs are very similar. It's really, it's Rav Mesas. It's some of these, it's not Rav Ovadia Yosef. So we also, I should say, we had a couple of rabbis, and right now for the last 4 years, I think it is, we have not had a rabbi. We've only had a president, my husband, who people mistake for the rabbi, though he is not. He's got a day job, but we don't have a rabbi. And so it's a very much of an active do-it-yourself synagogue run by its members.
Very cool. It's very strengthening. I found those kind of places very strengthening the community because you need everybody and everybody needs to be involved, and there's not someone else that will do the things. It's all like homemade. And,
that's right.
Sometimes it's frustrating, right? Oh, I wish we were like some other big place, but then it's great because everyone is needed. So that's. But
I'll just add real quick. There really is a renaissance of Sephardic culture in New York, and it's really incredible to see because it's done in conjunction with the larger Jewish community, and I think that it's really a model for how people can appreciate both. Growing up in Chicago, I was exotic. Sephardi meant, oh, you eat couscous. It didn't go beyond that. It didn't go the intellectual contribution of Sfaradim, the history of Sfaradim. And I think that now there's really a renaissance that's going beyond the superficial of eating kibbeh and couscous. And there's a lot happening. It's a really exciting time in New York.
Yeah, I was going to ask you when you mentioned that your parents were members of a Ashkenazi community. How were the feelings vis-a-vis that?
So, my father was a bon vivant.
Kind of a hard thing. Yeah.
Hard, but not for my father. He was really, he was on the board of his synagogue, very active. And I think he didn't expect it, because in Chicago, you don't really expect that. And he liked his synagogue for social, it was really an American synagogue in the sense that it was a social club. And for my parents at that stage in their life, that's exactly what they wanted. And for him, I think it was okay. But I do think that when my sister married my brother-in-law a year before me, who's Syrian, and I married a French Moroccan, I think that was nice for him. And, he loves all his sons. He loved all his sons-in-law. But I think it was nice for him that it was represented in his family now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. As we're progressing in the hour, I'll invite our audience to either put in questions in the chat or raise a hand. We'll continue talking, but if people have questions, I would love to hear from the audience and involve other people. So, matchmaking.
Yes.
Wow. Yes. How? Yeah, and there is, of course,
how did I get into
Soon
it?
by You and all the stories of the Upper West
Yes,
Side. I don't know if everybody's familiar, but the Upper West Side scene, a little bit like Srugim in Israel, maybe?
Srugim, exactly. Very similar.
Yerushalayim scene.
Yes,
so
yes, very similar.
Yeah.
Kind of like Katamon.
A little bit of like Katamon, especially the Upper West Side. And the show that's like on YouTube came out, that's called Soon by You.
Soon by You, yes.
Bekarov Etzlech. And a little bit about the Srugim scene in that area. So what it's like in the matchmaking world, the modern matchmaking world.
Right, matchmaking, right. This is not Fiddler on the Roof.
Right, yeah.
So I'll tell you, I got married at what's considered late in life. I was 37 when I met my husband, 38 when I got married. And it wasn't for lack of wanting. It was because I always lived in vibrant communities in Chicago and on the Upper West Side single. And there's a culture on the Upper West Side of being single. It's a real culture. It's a culture of friendship with people of the opposite gender. And sometimes it makes it easy to get married, and sometimes it makes it very difficult, very challenging. And so
it's like living with a bunch of cousins, no?
A little bit.
Like having a giant extended family where everybody's chevre. Yeah.
Right. It's that, but I'll tell you, it's also something else. It's also that because people are always together, they've lost the art of dating. I feel that the men weren't quite sure how to ask a woman out. The woman wasn't quite sure how to read the man. I remember being set up, not meeting people on my own and being out with a man and thinking, is this a date or am I a friend? He's taking me to dinner. There were so many questions. Things were not very clear cut. And that made it really challenging. And when I got married, I always did setups, but when I got married, I really wanted to do it more actively because first of all, I knew firsthand that it's challenging and I wanted to help people, but also because I felt that my husband and I had our hands in many different crowds in New York, American, Sephardic, international, French. And so we thought, I thought that it would be a good use of my time. And what I did is I got together a bunch of friends. Initially, it was mothers from my children's school because it's a very international Jewish school. And then it expanded. So it's and we meet once a month.
Just 1 second. Somebody's unmuted. I'll fix that. Go ahead.
So we basically meet once a month around someone's dining room table. And we just present people and we try to introduce people. So we've sent people on a lot of dates. We don't have a marriage yet, but we're hoping. It's been a little more challenging the last 6 months, although it's interesting. Yeah. There are 3 people from my synagogue who were the veteran singles of the synagogue, and they all got engaged during Corona. So wow. There's something there.
Any explanation? And I'm going to just get up and turn the light on for a minute.
Sure. I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing, but I think that people realized that there's a certain, I think people realized they don't want to be alone. And it was kind of a wake-up call to be serious. Because again, when you're on the Upper West Side, it's Sarot Shel Hashirim. right? Or we say in French, l'embarras du choix.
First world,
there's always
yeah.
someone, there's always someone around the next corner. If I don't like your hair color, well, I'm going to wait to meet the next guy. And if I don't like you, then I'll wait to meet the next, woman. And so I think it forced people to really kind of settle down. And that was a good thing. That was a really good thing. So that, yes, that's the matchmaking. It's very important, but it's very difficult. I always say, if only they didn't have to agree to my ideas, I could do a lot of good.
Let's touch on two other things. Journalism.
Sure.
Any particular interview or incident, kind of like you already told us, jumping on the plane and going to Morocco within 24 hours.
Sure.
Other interesting anecdotes from the world of more like Jewish community journalism, correct? Yeah.
Sure. I'll tell you two, if that's okay. Two of my favorites. One is that my mother is a big Elie Wiesel fan. And so growing up, his books were always in the house. She read all his books many times. She was really, really, and so I grew up feeling that Elie Wiesel was really the conscience of the world. So when he came out with his memoirs, this would be in 1995, I think, the first volume of his memoirs. He wrote them in French. All his books were written in French first. And so I was working for the Jewish newspaper here in Chicago. And I thought, okay, this is my opportunity. I'm going to read his book in French and interview him before it comes out in English, because no other English paper is going to do that. So with all the naivete of a 24-year-old, I got his book, I read it. And with all the naivete of a 24-year-old, I called his office at Boston University, and his teaching assistant answered. And I said, hi, I'm a French-speaking journalist from Chicago. I read Professor Wiesel's book, and I want to come to New York and interview him. And she said, okay, just a second, I'll put him on the phone. So she put him on the phone. And he said, okay, so come to New York. And it was, sometimes you just have to do things. You don't have to worry about protocol. And so I flew to New York, and he invited me to come to his house to interview him. I remember it was the weekend of Slichot, right before Rosh Hashanah. And he said, we were trying to find a time. And he said, if you can't come on Friday, come to Slichot in my synagogue. But I went to his house on a Friday, and he was very gracious, and it was so incredible to see him in his surroundings. I wrote an article that then won a prestigious award, but that really marked me, because here was a man who was so proud of his identity, so proud of who he was, so secure in who he was, and yet so humble. And I was able to ask him a few questions, personal questions that my mother had always wondered after reading his books. So that was really, and we kept up a little bit of a correspondence after that. He sent me his second book along with a card. So that was a really, really special for me.
You can send us the article, so we can add it to someplace on the website with the interview with you. That'd be great. Yes. Okay, and you said another one, a couple stories?
Yes. The other one was, I was an intern. So I was 21 years old at the newspaper that I would later become the editor of. And so I was brand new. It was a summer program. I was an intern. And my editor said to me, there's a synagogue. There's a neighborhood in Chicago where the synagogues are kind of like, there's very few Jews left, and they're struggling to have a minyan, and it's all these 80, 90-year-old men. Maybe that would make an interesting story. I said, okay. So I go in my car, and I said, I'll go for a morning minyan to see what's going on in these synagogues. So I was either a Monday or a Thursday, and I go at 7 a.m. And at the time, I drove a sports car, a Toyota Celica. I was 20. And I go to the synagogue for minyan. I think I'll get all these men and I'll interview them. So I get to inside the synagogue, and there's 9 men, and they're waiting. And they said, we're waiting for the rabbi. Can't have minyan. We're waiting for the rabbi. I said, okay. And then they're calling the rabbi. And then the rabbi says, I didn't get a ride this morning. So I find out the rabbi was 102 years old. And he would get a ride to synagogue, and his ride didn't come that day. And I said, well, I'll pick him up. So the 85-year-old, who was the young one in the synagogue, and he was a Holocaust survivor, said, okay, I'll show you where he lives. So he comes with me in my sports car to pick up a rabbi who was the last... Do you have enough
seats for this activity?
Well, I'll tell you. He was the last survived remaining student of the Slobodka Yeshiva, this rabbi, Yehuda Goldman. Yes. And I'd studied the Musar movement. So for me, this was a thrill. So with the 85-year-old, who's in incredible shape, we go pick up the rabbi. The rabbi comes in the front seat, and the 85-year-old gets in the back seat of a sports car. How? I don't know. And I did my article, and I kept up a relationship with this rabbi until he died 2 years later. I would go visit him in his nursing home, and such a special, special person. So I always say I became a Jewish journalist because I love Judaism and the Jewish people, and I'm curious, and journalism was just an excuse to learn about it, to learn about my people.
Yeah, wow, that sounds amazing. You're really kind of leaving us with the message of jump on opportunities. If something comes up, just go and do it.
Bridget, tell us a little
Yes.
bit also about Hebrew. And you can speak like 2 sentences in Hebrew, everyone will hear
Yes,
you.
you can
My
speak
Hebrew?
a lot. Yeah.
לא כל כך, יש לי מבטא צרפתית, אז כולם חושבים שאני מדברת כל כך טוב בגלל המבטא, אבל זה לא נכון. העברית שלי. אז כמו שאמרתי בהתחלה, ביליתי כמעט כל קיץ בארץ עם ההורים שלי, ועשיתי אולפנים, ולמדתי גם עברית באוניברסיטה, ויש לי הרבה חברים שהם ישראלים, ובעלי גם, הוא הלך לאוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, יש לו דרכון ישראלי, הוא צרפתי, אבל יש לו דרכון ישראלי, אז מסביב, יש לי הרבה תרבות ישראלית, אבל...
והילדים? הילדים גם יודעים אנגלית, עברית, צרפתית, מרוקאית?
כן ולא, מרוקאית לא, אבל הם יודעים צרפתית, לא מדברים כל כך, אבל מבינים את הכל. אנחנו מנסים, אבל זה כל כך קשה לדבר איתם בצרפתית, בחברה האמריקאית, אבל הם מבינים צרפתית מצוין. ועברית, אני חושבת שהבת שלי, שהיא כמעט 11, כי היא מדברת עברית יותר טוב מצרפתית. העברית שלה מעולה. והבן שלי הוא רק 8, אבל הוא לומד עברית. הוא מתחיל ללמוד עברית, והנה, אז זה כמו כמו שאמרתי.
כן.
הבית שלי והקהילה שלי.
הם ביקרו בישראל יחד איתכם? הילדים?
כן, כן, אנחנו בארץ הרבה פעמים, כן.
One more question, you can choose Hebrew or English, how you want to answer it. Wexner. And the whole maybe idea of how involved are we in some global we? I'm not sure who is included in the we. But maybe a couple words first. What is Wexner, in case not everybody's totally familiar with it? And the other thing is, I know I'm putting some of the answer in the front. Some of its goals is to impact the democracy in Israel. So a little bit unpacking these issues of being involved from afar, to what extent, how do we impact, you know, this little country here that is everybody's, but also...
So I should say, I no longer work for the Wexner Foundation. I left when my daughter was born almost 11 years ago. So I can't really speak. I know there's been a lot of media in Israel with Nadav Tamir and Alon Ben David. I know that there's been a lot there. When I joined Wexner in 2002, I joined to work on curriculum development for the American program. And then my role changed and I became director of alumni for all 3, director of alumni programming for all 3 Wexner programs. So I did interact a lot with the Israelis who came to spend a year at Harvard. And while they were there, they learned about the Jewish community. It's interesting. I really, for me, it was eye-opening because, like I said, I grew up going to Israel so much, but my knowledge of Israel was my Moroccan family in Israel, in Holon and Bat Yam and all these places, and my summer team tours and my university, my Ulpan at Hebrew University, and all the things that young Americans do. And here I got to know Israel through these Israelis, and I got to know really the subcultures of Israel, which was really fascinating for me. And some of those friendships I've kept. And I still have a few very close friends among the Israelis who did the program. I think the idea is to bring them to America and increase the understanding between American Jews and Israelis. And so spending a year in the Jewish community in Boston and elsewhere, learning about American Judaism, which is not just Orthodox, obviously primarily not Orthodox, Reform, conservative, secular, unaffiliated, exactly. And I think that's really important. And likewise, it's important for American Jews to learn about Israelis. For me, Wexner was really a fascinating part of my career because it mixed together intellectual ideas. I love discussing ideas, content, tochen, text, midrash, Talmud, Tanakh, real high-level learning, world-class professors, and also the social aspect. There's a lot of networking. Wexner is about networking with your peers to see best practices. So I'm a synagogue president in Cleveland, and I'm going to meet a synagogue president from San Francisco, and we're going to talk about what we can do. We're going to learn from each other. Or I'm in LA, and my city is paired with Tel Aviv. I'm going to meet a Wexner Israeli who's in charge, who's in the environment, Ministry of the Environment, and we're going to do something about the fog in LA, right? There was a lot of shidduchim to be made, really interesting shidduchim to be made. And so for me, it combined all those elements. And like I said, I'm just very curious about my Judaism, and I always say, I have a degree in Tanakh, a master's degree in Tanakh. So I always say my favorite pasuk in all of Tanakh is B'toch Ami Anochi Yoshevet, right? Which is spoken by the Isha Shunamit. B'toch Ami Anochi Yoshevet. They ask her, what do you want? She can name any price, a material thing, right? And she says, no. She says, I want to dwell among my people. And it's my favorite verse because it's so simple and it's so powerful. And that's just kind of how I feel. I love the totality of the Jewish people and Judaism. And so for me, journalism, Wexner, these were just all different ways for me to, contribute to this great Jewish experiment.
Okay, with this message, let me open up if anyone wants to unmute, ask any questions, Ivrit or Anglit. If it's long Ivrit and necessary, we can translate or whatever is necessary to do. Yehuda?
Shalom.
Shalom.
I want to ask about two things.
Sure.
The first one is about the attitude to Jews, to Orthodox communities in New York, especially, and in Chicago also. But and the next question is about as a journalist, New York Times is its attitude to Jews, to Israel, is not so
loving.
Not always, no.
Ask about this. How do Jews see it?
So for your first question, what do you mean the attitude of the Orthodox? You mean?
With the involved with the corona,
you mean were they following social distancing and the guidelines?
I think the attitude of the greater community towards the Orthodox Jewish community, no?
Yes.
Okay.
But לגבי corona.
כן.
כן, אנטישמיות או...
Yeah. I think people are always surprised to hear this, but in New York or anywhere, even in Israel, when you say the Orthodox community, it is much more diverse than if you say the Reform community, I think. Because which Orthodox community? Is it the Haredim in Brooklyn? Is it the Hasidim? Is it Avi Weiss, modern Orthodox feminism? Is it YU, Yeshiva University? Is it people in the suburbs who are, have two cars and go to a job? Which part of the Orthodox community? So I will say this. I think that there were a lot of concerns at the beginning because, as I said, when Corona started, it really went straight for the modern Orthodox community, SAR, those synagogues. And I think there was a lot of concern when we didn't know so much about Corona, are the Jews spreading it? That didn't really happen, thankfully. And I think that then there was concern, are the Haredim in Brooklyn, are they really being careful? Are they social distancing? Are they still having their weddings with 800 people? And I don't know if you heard, but there was a funeral for a Hasidic rabbi, in Brooklyn, and I think there were 800 Jews on the street for the funeral. And this is in the height of Corona, maybe early May. And Mayor de Blasio wrote in a public tweet, enough, to the Jewish community, this is enough. And so people were very upset because he painted the entire Jewish community with one broad stroke. And people also felt that, okay, a few weeks later, there were protests over George Floyd, and there were hundreds of people, thousands of people on the street, and he didn't call them out. So there were some of those feelings, if you will. But I think what happened also is because the Orthodox community was so hard hit with Corona, they became the first to donate plasma. And so something like 70%, I think, of the plasma donors at the beginning of plasma donation were Haredim from Brooklyn. I think it's difficult to say what's the attitude toward the Orthodox community, because again, it's such a big community. I think by and large, the Jewish community took Corona very seriously, very early on. I think we really knew what we were up against. And I know that myself, because New York was hit very early on, I remember calling my mother, and I have a sister in Chicago, and they thought I was crazy. I said to my mother, you can't go to Starbucks. You can't go out. And she said, what are you talking about? In Chicago, everything's fine. And I said, but it won't be in 2 weeks, so let's start now. Does that answer your question a little bit? Great. New York Times. Okay, well, I'll tell you this. I'll give you two answers. One answer is, I'm trained as a journalist. I have a bachelor's and a master's in journalism. I believe in journalism. I believe in the free marketplace of ideas. I believe censorship is terrible. I believe self-censorship, government censorship. And so I will support the right of the New York Times. I will support the right of Al Jazeera to publish what they publish. I will support all of that with all my principles. Having said that, you vote with your eyes and you vote with your money. So I don't enjoy reading the New York Times. I read a lot of it online, but for the newspaper that I receive at home, I choose the Wall Street Journal. I find that it resonates with me better. And I think, yes, there are instances where the New York Times, particularly the international edition, not so much the New York edition, had some very questionable cartoons or articles. And that was really too bad. And I know that when Barry Weiss left, she exposed a whole other strain, not just anti-Semitism at the New York Times, but really, if you don't believe whatever the dogma is, the orthodoxy, the liberal orthodoxy, you can't publish. And I believe her. I believe she felt that. There's no reason not to believe her. And I think that's too bad. I think that all the extremes, I work out on the treadmill every morning. And so this is what I do. One day I watch Fox News and one day I watch CNN. And I swear we're living in two different countries. And CNN will have the news and they have a slant. And they didn't used to be like this. And it's really too bad for me. I think it's hurting the cause of journalism, where they are really criticizing Trump. And I'm not a Trump fan, but they are criticizing him. Every angle, every story is, what did he do wrong? They're not covering other stories. And Fox News is basically a mouthpiece for Donald Trump, doing somersaults and backward tumbles to justify anything he says. So when he said hydroxychloroquine was a good treatment, so now they all go on, they're all doctors and they say it. The media has gone to extremes. I feel like the Wall Street Journal is still good and moderate. But yes, I think your sentiment on the New York Times is shared by a lot of people.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in the audience that would like to ask?
The feeling I have that they have a lot of influence, and sometimes they even make people believe in many things more than it really is. And it becomes stronger and stronger.
Right.
A lot of strength they have in their hands, yeah. Much more than before.
The New York Times, you're saying?
Generally,
yes, yeah. They do. But don't forget, in American Judaism right now, the American Jewish community, the part of the community that was very staunchly pro-Israel, no matter who was the Rosh Mimshala, the apex, right? That's kind of the older generation on the way out. And there's now a very vocal, very active part of the Jewish community that is much more liberal, much more left on Israel. And I think that's something that was not the case 10, 20 years ago. And so you have a bit of a split in the community. And yes, you'll have the traditional or the Masorati community still kind of in that camp of being staunchly pro-Israel, in kind of like whoever the Rosh Mimshala is, we support Israel. And then you have a part of the community that feels that they have a moral responsibility to challenge Israel where they think Israel is wrong. And so when you have a political leader or a newspaper that is taking a stance against the Israeli government, they're not doing it in a vacuum. They also have the backing of many American Jews.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other burning issues between Israel, Morocco, France, New York, and Chicago?
By the way, I was in Morocco and it's great. It's a great, yeah.
It's beautiful.
So interesting, beautiful, lovely people, much more than I thought.
Absolutely. Very welcoming, right?
Welcoming, very welcoming. Not only the Jews.
Yes. Well, I'll leave you with one story of Morocco, because Moroccan Jews are known to have such a strong identity. And, you know, it's funny, Rav Ovadia Yosef once said to Rabbi Messas, "You Moroccan Jews think the Torah was given only to you." And Rabbi Messas answered him, "It was." So Moroccan Jews have a lot of affinity and a lot of love for Morocco and a lot of love for the king of Morocco. So when I was 11 years old, living in Chicago, my father went to a party at the Moroccan consulate in Chicago, and the Prince of Morocco, the king's brother, was at that party. And it was a Thursday night, and my father on the spot said to him, "Why don't you come to my house for Shabbat dinner tomorrow? My wife will make you a Moroccan meal." So he comes home on Thursday at midnight and says to my mother, "The prince is coming for dinner tomorrow night," with his entourage of, 20 people. So that's how it came to be that when I was 11, the Prince of Morocco and his entourage came to have Shabbat dinner at my house. They closed off my street, and I remember it. It was so memorable because for my grandfather, my father's father, who was alive at the time, this was, wow, I've really arrived. I've left Morocco, and now the prince is coming to my son's house. It was really amazing. So yes, and I have to tell you, we had a traditional Shabbat dinner, and it was lovely. And I just remember that the prince went in the kitchen with my mom, and she showed him the spices and the couscous, and it was just really a lovely meal, because it was a lovely experience, because I couldn't articulate it this way at the time. What I would say now is that was a melding of all my identities: Jewish, Israeli, Moroccan, in America. And really, that's right. That's what we all try to do. We have pieces of ourselves from all different places, all different influences, and sometimes they all come together in a moment of clarity.
That's an experience.
Yes.
It's a fabulous story to close with, because I think that's what I'm feeling from you. That's kind of what I think you're leaving me with. It's not just the melding of identities, but that each one of these identities found room to be or express itself in some ways, which is not so simple.
Right.
Sometimes that melding, becomes like a cholent. Everything becomes tasting the same. And here it feels like you really have been able, in the best way possible. It's not a perfect world, but to express the different parts of the identity and make peace with them. And it's a very beautiful feeling to be left with for me.
Thank you.
I see Tamar unmuting. Did you want to ask something?
No, I just wanted to add that it was very, very, very interesting to listen to this lady. And
Thank you.
I also was in Morocco, and I also have a very beautiful exhibition from Morocco. I know, Shoshi, did you see my exhibition?
No, not the Moroccan one.
Now with Zoom, we can all visit.
I had תערוכת יחיד, מרוב התרגשות אני שוכחת את המילים באנגלית, 60 צילומים ממרוקו. Morocco is very, very special.
60 photographs and a single exhibition.
I always envy the Moroccan people for the mimuna. I said to myself, why didn't I, that my parents came from Germany, why didn't we have a mimuna?
We were lucky to have anything, forget the
Exactly, that's right, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. Lovely, really lovely.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your story and presence with us. Hopefully the recording for this will work and we'll be able to share it back with you.
I would love that.
So,
And
you know,
good
maybe
health.
one day we'll meet here, there, everywhere, and
Exactly.
our different identities.
That's right, that's right. Thank you so much. Erev Tov to all of you.
Erev Tov and good health for everyone.
Amen. Thank you. Toda. Bye-bye.
Bye.